Just to give everybody an FYI, when you're on your computer, the Zoom will load up. You click on the Zoom box on your desktop. There's actually, when you say to join and you have to type in the number, that's actually a drop-down box. And if you click on that, it'll pull a little drop-down box, and it will have the conference number 669 as the only number that you have. You just click on it and it'll automatically rejoin you again. But look on your desktop for your Zoom icon. Just click on that. It will open up a box, and then there will be a box that says join. And then where you would type in the number would be the drop-down box. So, hey, it is 6:31. What a great presentation, Archbishop, last week, and I know we're all looking forward to it this week. So we're going to let you get started and going. So.
Okay, thank you. We'd got to St. Anselm and the reign of William Rufus last week. And this is really where the investiture controversy takes off in the context of the English Church. Now, investiture might not seem like a big deal to us today, but back in the in the early Middle Ages, it really did become a major issue between the papacy and the various European monarchies, mainly because kings regarded bishops as being one of their largest groups of tenants-in-chief. They were comparable to the barons. Therefore, they owed feudal duty and feudal dues to the king as their overlord. The popes, on the other hand, wanted an independent church. And exactly how that relationship was going to work out in practice was one of the great controversies of the 12th century. Now, up until the aggressive centralizing tendencies of Archdeacon Hildebrand in the mid-1000s, there hadn't really been a problem. Kings invested bishops with their ring and pastoral staff at the same time as they took their oaths of loyalty and obedience to the king. And so they were very much part of the fabric of the kingdom. But with the popes wanting an independent church, of course, independent under their control, this was no longer acceptable to Rome. And Anselm, who'd been very much brought up in the reforming movement of the mid-11th century, he was born in 1034 in Italy, he firmly believed in papal control of the church. So when William Rufus wanted to continue the same arrangement that his father had had, which was the king investing bishops with their ring and pastoral staff, he wasn't going to play along. It was also quite clear to Anselm that Rufus was not really interested in protecting the position of the church. For Rufus, it was just another source of income. So he kept bishoprics vacant at will to augment the royal income. It was probably with something approaching relief that Anselm found out that William Rufus had accidentally walked into an arrow in the New Forest whilst out hunting and was no longer a problem, because Henry I proved to be a lot more flexible when it came to the relationship between church and state. Henry was the third son of William the Conqueror, and he had something of his father's diligence and grasp of administration, to the point where Henry can be really regarded as being the second founder of the Norman state in England. He was prepared to meet Anselm halfway. His basic take was, okay, you want the ring and the staff to be invested by a bishop on behalf of the Pope. That's fine with me, providing the bishops come to me and still swear allegiance as feudal tenants in chief. And this compromise lasted the rest of the 12th century. Henry was also something of a church reformer. One of the unhappy relics of the Danish period in English church history was that certain dioceses were overlarge. The two main culprits were Durham and Lincoln. Lincoln's major problem was that it stretched from the Humber to the Thames and encompassed some 10 English counties, around about a fifth of the land area of England. And so in order to bring it a little more under control, Henry I saw to the foundation first of the bishopric of Ely, which took Cambridgeshire and parts of Huntingdonshire out of the Diocese of Lincoln, and then a little bit later on, to divide the Diocese of Durham, he founded the Diocese of Carlisle. And this brings the total number of English dioceses up to 17, which was to be the number for the rest of the Middle Ages. The bishops were predominantly Norman French. Most of them were also first and foremost royal servants. Archbishops of Canterbury were always on the King's Council, and very frequently they held one of the high offices of state, whether it was Chancellor or Justiciar or the Lord Privy Seal. One of the high offices of state was always held by the Archbishop of Canterbury. And this close relationship between church and state was to remain characteristic of English life, in fact European life, for the rest of the Middle Ages. One of the things that's very characteristic of this middle part of the Norman period is there are two major movements going on. First of all, you have a great rebuilding. The Normans were great builders. Not only did they build a vast number of castles to keep England under proper supervision of its new Norman overlords, but also they rebuilt all of the English cathedrals. And at the same time, most parish churches were rebuilt. There is hardly a cathedral or a parish church in England of early medieval date that doesn't have some sort of thumbprint left on it by the Normans. Now, in some cases, it's very obvious, like Peterborough, Ely, and Durham, all are very obviously Norman churches to this day. But in other places, for example, York, it's much subtler. York has an extremely wide nave, which is a relic of the fact that the Normans built a wide aisleless nave at York in the 1080s, and so later buildings had to conform to the 45-foot square that had been used by the original Norman builders. Ripon, just up the road, by the way, is a smaller copy. And so most of our English cathedrals have some sort of Norman thumbprint somewhere in the structure. The two obvious exceptions are St. Paul's, which was completely rebuilt after the Great Fire of London in 1666, and Salisbury, which was rebuilt on a greenfield site in the early 13th century. It's also a period when monasticism takes off. The number of monasteries in England in the 1065 was approximately 35. By the end of the century, this has risen to 100, and it was to continue rising until the middle of the 13th century. Most of the new foundations under William the Conqueror and William Rufus were Benedictine houses, either the regular Benedictines or the Cluniac reform, which had started in the 9th century. They re-established monasteries in places like York and Whitby, places where there had not been a monastic presence for probably 150 to 200 years. And also in his reforming zeal, Lanfranc and some of the other bishops converted the old Anglo-Saxon loosely constituted cathedral chapters into new monastic houses. And so by 1115, 8 out of the 17 English cathedrals were cathedral priories. They had monastic communities rather than a dean and chapter. And that included Canterbury, Rochester, Winchester, Worcester, Norwich, Durham, Carlisle, and Ely, all of which had to be refounded by Henry VIII following the dissolution of the monasteries. The others retained the typical Anglo-Norman chapter system with a dean, chancellor, treasurer, and precentor, and a variable number of canons presiding over the cathedral establishment and living in their own houses around the close. The centre of York and the centre of Lincoln to this day are dominated by the houses built by the cathedral chapter during the Middle Ages. The cathedral priories often had very uneasy relationships with their bishops. In one case, the Archbishop of Canterbury of the time went so far as to start building a new collegiate church a few miles north of Canterbury, which he hoped he could convert into a new cathedral so that he could be rid of those pesky monks down at Christ Church. But there was another factor driving monasticism, and that was that Norman lords saw it as part of their duty to provide monastic establishments to pray not only for their own souls and those of their ancestors, but for those of the community as a whole. And the Normans seemed to be particularly interested in reform movements, so that in the 1130s, the Cistercian movement, a further reform, this time in the direction of austerity of the Benedictine order, came into England. And they settled predominantly in Yorkshire, which was pretty empty at the time, thanks to William the Conqueror's harrying of the north around the year 1070. And so a series of large Cistercian houses were founded in Yorkshire in the 1130s, the 1140s, the 1150s. Fountains, Byland, Jervaux, Mews, all were founded in this period. And the white monks were very popular with the Norman aristocracy because they represented the same sort of single-minded devotion to the cause that was very common amongst Norman warlords. And as a result of this, the Cistercian order received a lot of noble patronage, but they weren't sorry about that, but they weren't so popular with yeoman farmers, because if you had a Cistercian monastery move into the area, the chances were they were going to clear the land around them of their existing tenants so that they could farm it directly by the use of lay brothers. The lay brothers were a kind of second-class monk. They weren't necessarily literate. Their participation in the monastic round was confined to mass and relatively simple offices that could be memorized, which was said at the same time as the choir offices were sung in the choir of the monastic church. In the nave of a Cistercian church was not a place for the general public. They never got further than the Galilee Chapel, which was built outside of the western doors of the church. Instead, it was used by the lay brothers as their particular place of prayer. And the Cistercians, despite their holy reputation, were also extremely sound businessmen. It's something of a one pace back moment when you go to Byland Abbey, and you look across the site, and in one corner there's rather a large building which has the marks of having been subjected to a considerable amount of heat at one time in its existence. And you find out that that was the place where the monks were smelting iron on an industrial scale. They also operated a large water-driven fulling mill to maximize the profits from their estates. So although the Cistercians were an austere order, they rarely ate meat. About half of the year consisted of fasting days. Their churches lacked stained glass windows, coloured vestments, large amounts of statuary. The order itself became wealthy and influential. And there's this ongoing dialogue in the Cistercian order throughout the Middle Ages where the more enthusiastic Cistercians worry about what this wealth is doing to the spirituality of the order. Another reform movement that came into England during the 1170s in the wake of the murder of Thomas Becket was the Carthusian order, which really consists of a group of hermits who live in little cells around the cloister and only gather together 3 times a day, once for matins, once for the conventual mass, which was followed by dinner, and then finally for vespers, and spend the rest of their time on their own in their cells. And the Carthusian order came to England as a result of one of the less planned events during the investiture controversy. Now, after the death of Henry I in 1135, there is almost 20 years of what can only be described as anarchy. Henry's only surviving child was the Empress Maud, and she was probably the stronger claimant to the throne. However, she had a cousin, Stephen, who, being male, was preferred by a considerable section of the barons as a potential king. But Stephen was indecisive and Maud was determined. So the two of them got involved in a sort of unholy deadlock, which lasted for almost 20 years until it was agreed that when Stephen died, he would be succeeded by Henry Plantagenet, who was a descendant of Henry I through his daughter. And when this takes place in 1154, you have a very determined, a very capable, and a not altogether scrupulous man as King of England, Duke of Normandy, and through his marriage, he has considerable holdings in France. And as a result of this, the conflict between the church and the king over investiture kicks off once again. And the key figure in this is Thomas Becket, born in Southwark near London around 1110, educated in the household of Archbishop Theobald. He was at first the creature of the Archbishop, then the creature of the king. He was a lawyer first and foremost in his early life. He took deacon's orders. He was appointed Archdeacon of Canterbury. But for much of his early life, there isn't really much evidence that he took his spiritual responsibilities very seriously at all. He was a good, solid, legal officer of the crown, and he devoted himself to the royal service. When the old archbishop died in 1162, to Henry's way of thinking, the logical thing to do was to appoint his ally, Thomas Becket, as Archbishop of Canterbury. But, and Thomas Becket warned him of this, Becket was one of those people who fulfilled the role that he was given. And so if he left the royal service, if he ceased to be the Lord Chancellor and became the Archbishop of Canterbury, his loyalty would naturally have to shift, because he'd bought into the reforming ideas of the 11th century papacy, his loyalty would naturally have to shift from the king to the papacy. Henry would not be dissuaded. Thomas Becket was duly ordained priest and then consecrated bishop the next day, and takes up office as the Archbishop of Canterbury. And the first thing that he does is insist that Henry gives proper deference to the papacy, declares the church free, and also no longer requires the feudal homage that had been part and parcel of the relationship between church and king for most of the 12th century. Henry, predictably, does not like this idea very much, and Thomas Becket finds it prudent to withdraw to a Cistercian monastery in northern France to let Henry cool off for a while. And eventually a peace is brokered and Becket returns to England, only to get into another fight with the king over investiture and retreat back to France. At the end of the day, in 1169, there's another patched up peace between Henry and Thomas, and he returns to England. But his first act is to excommunicate the Bishop of London and the Bishop of Salisbury, who had taken Henry's side in the controversy. And of course, rather famously, Henry loses his temper and shouts out, "Who will rid me of this turbulent priest?" And the net result was that 4 of his knights, all of whose names sound suspiciously like they were made up after the event, disappear out of the court, ride to Canterbury, confront the Archbishop, and the net result is that the Archbishop ends up dead on the floor in the north transept of Canterbury Cathedral, and Henry II is left with a tremendous amount of egg on his face. In spite of Henry's protestations that he never intended it to go that far, none of the knights who were involved in the assassination of Thomas à Becket were ever brought to justice. They're allowed to disappear into Flanders, into the Holy Roman Empire, and there they stay unmolested for the rest of their days. The papacy takes advantage of the bad publicity that Henry had attracted to himself by knocking off his archbishop, and as a result of this, Henry is forced to accept papal claims, and also in 1174 has to undergo a humiliating penance at the hands of the monks of Christ Church Priory in Canterbury. He is required to march barefoot from the edge of town, the last pilgrimage station on the edge of town, to the shrine of Thomas Becket. When he gets to the shrine, he approaches it on his knees, is beaten with rods by the monks, and leaves a considerable amount of cash behind him, which I'm sure was the most painful part of the whole exercise for Henry II, to help fund the rebuilding of Canterbury Cathedral. Becket's death rearranged the relationship between church and state to the point where, in most respects, provided the papacy respected Henry's opinion, he was prepared to let the papacy have what it thought was its rights from the English church. So taxation paid to Rome, papal approval of senior appointments, the investiture of ring and pastoral staff by the papal legate. The papal legates were granted a fair amount of freedom of action, and that remains the relationship through the rest of Henry's reign up to his death in 1189. Richard the Lionheart is probably the second worst king in English history from the point of view of being King of England. He was never there. He was either in the Holy Land or in France or in captivity somewhere for 9.5 of the 10 years that he reigned. As a result of this, it's really impossible to say much about his policy in England. It was a convenient cash cow to finance his crusades. Needless to say, his crusading made him extremely popular with the papal court. And he left the administration of England very largely in the hands of the bishops and the senior noblemen, although his brother, Prince John, took an increasing role in the administration of England. After Richard's accidental death in a siege in Aquitaine in 1199, he's succeeded by his brother John. And John has a nickname which he proceeds to live up to. He was known, because he was not granted any significant estates as a young man, as John Lackland. And he certainly increased the problem. He lost most of England's holdings in France between 1199 and 1208. He also, by his capricious and unstable government, alienated most of the barons. He found himself lumbered with Stephen Langton as Archbishop of Canterbury, who, after a botched election by the monks of Christ Church, a failed attempt at providing a royal candidate, had been imposed by the Pope on an unwilling John. Stephen Langton spends the first 6 years of his term as Archbishop of Canterbury cooling his heels in France and Italy, waiting for the political situation to change sufficiently for him to actually go to Canterbury and take office. The papacy does its best to help him by placing England under interdict in 1208. This means all religious services cease except for baptisms and burials. There is no mass. The office is said in private by the clergy. There are no public services. And this goes on for quite a long time. It's only when John himself is excommunicated that he sort of says, okay, I need to back up a little bit here and acknowledge papal authority so that we can get this interdict lifted. But from John's point of view, it was just a concession that he had to make during what was a period of very arbitrary rule. And poor old Stephen Langton, who was a learned and godly man, finds himself rather in the middle between the Pope and the King. Having been a staunch supporter of papal claims over the English Church, when he attempts to assist the barons by helping John see sense and sign the Magna Carta, he promptly gets excommunicated by the Pope. And it's a couple of years before he's restored to office as Archbishop of Canterbury. John humiliatingly has to sign away his kingdom to the Pope and receive it back again as a papal vassal. And this really rubs the aristocracy of England up the wrong way. They don't want to be papal vassals. They want a king who'll obey the law. And this is what lies behind Magna Carta. And when Magna Carta was first signed and copied, a copy was sent to each of the English cathedrals. And one of the better copies of Magna Carta that survives to this day is housed in Lincoln Cathedral. You can go and see it if it's actually at home. They tend to tour it around the world on quite a regular basis. Once John died in 1216, whilst crossing the Wash, he seems to have picked up some sort of an infection, and he died at Newark. The crown passed to his 9-year-old son, Henry III. Henry III was a mild and pious ruler who in the early part of his reign, of course, once his minority finished in 1225, who in the early part of his reign relied very heavily on the advice of the various papal legates that were sent to England. After all, you could talk to the papal legates and get impartial advice, whereas if you talked to the various barons and earls in England, you had to deal with the whole complicated network of dynastic alliances and local interests. Henry also allowed papal taxes to be gathered. He allowed papal provision to English benefices, and generally allowed the English church to be very much under papal and therefore Italian control. Every now and again, this would drive the bishops to distraction, and there's a famous story that Robert Grosseteste, the learned Bishop of Lincoln in the final year of his life, was finally driven to the point where he receives a letter requiring him to appoint a nephew of the Pope as a canon of Lincoln Cathedral, and he writes back saying, "I refuse, I rebel." And he absolutely refuses to appoint the papal nephew as a canon of Lincoln Cathedral. And this sort of tension between the English bishops, the English church, and the papal court is to be one of the threads that runs through the High Middle Ages and the later Middle Ages in English church history. Now, to back up a little bit, one of the other things that is brought to the English church by the Normans is a whole intellectual revival. Lanfranc and Anselm were both learned men. They promoted schools. There's a flourishing period in the 12th century where there's a series of historians: Florence of Worcester, Simeon of Durham, John of Malmesbury, Gerald of Wales. We see the establishment of the first English university at Oxford somewhere around 1167, 1170 AD. After one of the not infrequent incidents between Town and Gown in Oxford, a group of students migrated to Cambridge around 1209 and set up a new university there. Rather amusingly, Lord Dacre, in his History of Oxford University, comments that a bunch of dissident scholars left Oxford and went and settled on the banks of the Cam, and as far as we know, they are still there. The animosity between Oxford and Cambridge is definitely long running. This produced a much more learned clergy. I've already alluded to Bishop Grosseteste, who was one of the most learned men of the Middle Ages. He was one of those who discussed the rotation of the earth. Certainly, like most medieval scholars, he firmly believed that the world was round. And as a result, he was involved in quite a lot of mathematical experimentation during his period in the University of Paris. It's a period that sees the Chancellor as being the one of the most important officers in a cathedral chapter, because every secular cathedral, which means in the 13th century Chichester, London, Old Sarum, Bath, Exeter, Lincoln, and York and Lichfield, were all expected to maintain a cathedral school to produce suitable candidates for the priesthood. And the most gifted of those candidates went on to the new universities to take their bachelor's degree, then their divinity degree, a course which lasted somewhere around 10 to 14 years in the 13th century. As the clergy became more literate and more learned, so Oxford and Cambridge grew as centres of learning. The average parish during this period also experiences a revolution. I've already alluded to the great Norman building boom. Well, just as the cathedrals were rebuilt, so were the parish churches. In my hometown, both churches were rebuilt in the latter part of the 11th century. The chancel of the Anglo-Saxon St. Peter's Church was taken down and replaced by a small Norman nave and chancel, approximately quadrupling the size of the church. This was extended again by the middle of the 12th century to produce quite a large parish church, whilst across the road at St. Mary's, a Norman chapel some 30 feet by 75 feet had been constructed around 1070 AD, and this pattern is repeated all over the country. Tremendous amount of building.
Hey, your Archbishop, excuse me. Hey, real quickly, hey, what is your hometown?
Barton-on-Humber.
Okay, yep.
And this rebuilding program goes on all over England. At the same time, the parochial system is completed. The lord of the manor built a church and provided a priest. The priest was granted the tithes from that particular parish and was known as the rector. Now, by the middle of the 12th century, the practice is growing up whereby monastic establishments get themselves appointed as rectors so they can receive the tithe revenue, and they appoint a substitute as the parish priest, hence the term vicar, vicarius, substitute. And these vicars received only the small tithes, about a third of the income of most parishes. And as the Middle Ages progressed, about 70% of English parishes were impropriated by one ecclesiastical corporation or another. Barton-on-Humber, the rectory there, became the property of the Benedictine Abbey of Bardney. As a result of that, the vicar was appointed by the abbot, and the abbot was able to convert the glebe farm into a grange for his monks. This helped the economy of Bardney Abbey and maybe wasn't too damaging to the spiritual welfare of Barton-on-Humber. But throughout England, this pattern goes on. And so the distinction between vicar and rector in England is not to do with who appoints them, but how they are paid in the medieval church. If a vicarage was really wealthy, there was a danger that the vicarage itself would be impropriated, in which case a perpetual curate was appointed who was paid a fixed salary in money rather than receiving a variable income in kind through the tithe. By 1200 AD, the structure of the English church and its financial system has achieved the form which it was to have for the next 700 years. So nothing significantly changes in terms of the organization of the English church between about 1150 and 1850. And in that 700 years, in spite of the Reformation, things remain from an organizational standpoint very largely the same. The great achievements of this period are the revival of monasticism, the establishment of the universities, and the rebuilding, both physically and structurally, of the English church. But what of the fringe, the Celtic fringe? England, as the largest of the kingdoms on the islands of Britain, had a disproportionate influence. Wales seems to have dropped into line with English custom quite early on. The four Welsh bishoprics of Bangor, St Asaph, St David's and Llandaff were firmly in place by 1070 AD. Scotland moves from its old abbatial form of church government towards conventional dioceses under the influence of St Margaret of Scotland, who was an Aethelling, therefore a relative of the Anglo-Saxon royal family. And this leads to the establishment of the dioceses of Glasgow, Dunblane, Dunkeld, Aberdeen, Murray, and Caithness. Ross, St Andrews, and Galloway are a little bit older. And this brings the Scottish Church into the Western European mainstream. What isn't often understood about the English involvement in Ireland is they were really encouraged by the papacy to invade Ireland to modernize the church and bring it fully into the orbit of the Roman Church in the mid-12th century. The English Pope Hadrian IV gives a papal bull to Henry II, authorizing him to send knights to Ireland, led by Hugh de Clare, who's commonly referred to as Strongbow, to help the High King of Ireland impose his will. But of course, the back channel to this was that they were to encourage the implementation of the decisions of the Synod of Rathbrasil in 1146, which converted Ireland from a monastically governed church, the clan monastery, the abbot as the dominant figure, the bishop kind of as a sacramental minister, into the conventional diocesan structure that was found in the rest of Europe. One of the ironies is that despite its small population, Ireland had an incredibly large number of bishops, 34 in the mid-12th century, and the dioceses were tiny, particularly when compared to England. But part of the subtext to the Norman invasion of England isn't just the usual Anglo-Norman desire for expansion, but also the usual Anglo-Norman desire to be the obedient son of the church and bring Ireland into line with the rest of Western Europe. There really is a turning point at the end of Henry III's reign. You've reached the full flowering of the medieval church. Salisbury Cathedral is being rebuilt, which sort of symbolically represents the great flowering of early English Gothic architecture. At the same time, the rebuilding of Westminster Abbey has begun. The great churches begin to be rebuilt from their Norman form into something that we would begin to recognize today. It's also a period when theologically the church begins to decline. If you look at the writings, say, of Anselm or Lanfranc or Peter Abelard, you're very much in the Augustinian tradition that goes back to Gregory the Great and St. Augustine of Hippo in the 5th and 6th centuries, respectively. But by 1225, 1250, you're beginning to get other voices. Thomas Aquinas is the final flowering of the old Augustinian tradition. And you have nominalism, which has some of its most significant figures amongst the English bishops and archdeacons, becomes more influential as the 14th century progresses. And that's something that I would like to look at next time. I see the time has crept round to 7:15, so it's probably question time at this point. This is where everybody tries to find their button.
Yeah, that's where I just took me my stumbling minute to find the button here, and well, I got to get situated and re-find in my book. I had a couple questions for you. You talked about the Magna Carta, and I'll give time for everybody to jump back in. But, that was really from not so much a church standpoint, which we can tie that in, but you're more of a definite student of the historical context of English history as a whole. Maybe you can expand a little bit more on, because really it was the Magna Carta that really kind of pushed us into even an American democracy, or it was actually the crevice point of changing the world in terms of the Magna Carta. And maybe you can, instead of just glancing over that for a second, and can you really give us a little more grasp on what that did for the English people?
Not much. However, if you were a baron, it was very important, because it defined the relationship between the tenants-in-chief, the barons, the bishops, the other major nobles, and the monarchy. The monarchy was no longer in a position to abuse any sort of dominance it got over the aristocracy. Both sides had to live according to the law. And the idea that is significant in Magna Carta isn't that it grants any sort of particular rights, but it's this notion that the king also has to be obedient to the law. And this counteracts the very prevalent early medieval notion that, in a sense, the king was a law unto himself, subject only to, in theory, the Pope, but most kings were keen to run down the authority of the Pope. The other key provision of Magna Carta is that the church shall be free. In other words, it limits the ability of the king to interfere with the running of the church. What it basically introduces into English constitutional law is the idea that everybody has, I'm not going to use the word rights, because that's not really a medieval concept. Everybody has duties and privileges, and the king can no longer arbitrarily remove anybody's privileges, providing that they fulfill their duties as loyal feudal subjects to him. I hope that didn't rain on everybody's parade too much. Magna Carta the significance of Magna Carta has more to do with Whig constitutional history than it does with how significant it was at the time. Basically what it does is it sets in writing the relationship between the king and his barons. So it's actually the first beginning of the notion of a constitution. Air quotes strictly needed on that.
And I don't want to jump in on anybody that's got a question. If somebody has a question, please jump in. But, we're through the 1400s, and John Wycliffe.
Next week.
Oh,
I haven't done Thomas Brad.
Because he was supposed to be, you're at the end of the 1400s.
77.
Oh, okay, so you're going to jam on him next week. Okay.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yeah, because you can't really go into John Wycliffe without looking at Thomas Bradwardine.
Okay.
Because Wycliffe is a product of a school of theology that exists at Oxford during the 14th century. He doesn't miraculously come out of nowhere.
Right, and I just thought, I didn't know where we're transitional stages, but hey, does some folks have some questions? Because I can dominate the question stage.
I have one. Can I
Great.
go ahead?
Yeah.
This is Paul Slish. Archbishop, during this period of around 1000 to 1200, kind of what was the English church's view on salvation and how you got it? This is before the Reformation, before the real talk about justification by faith, and we have Paul, in him we have a redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of our trespasses in Ephesians. Kind of what was the view of the people, and maybe even the priests and bishops, as to, all right, how do I get right with God?
The educated would very much have gone along with the idea that you were baptized into the church, which is the ark of salvation. You were justified by faith, and that good works were the product of faith. So the Augustinian understanding of salvation is still there. In practical terms, with the influence of monasticism and the growing influence of nominalism, you see the beginning of the shift from the late patristic understanding, which is a sort of modified Augustinianism, into the synergism of the High Middle Ages about 1150. Now, what the common person actually thought about salvation, I think probably was more along the lines of, you get your kids baptized, you go to Mass, you pay your tithes, you pay due deference to the church, you say your prayers. They were more interested in just, you try and be a good Christian. I don't think they trouble their heads overly much about theology. Certainly the cult of the saints is nowhere near as well developed as it was to be in the later Middle Ages. And one interesting feature of the English medieval liturgy is that in the actual fixed parts of the liturgy, the saints aren't that much of a presence. You get a very short list of saints, for example, in the Confitia. I confess to God Almighty, to Blessed Mary, ever Virgin, and to all the saints, that I have sinned exceedingly in thought, word, and deed. Not the long list of saints you get in the Tridentine Roman Rite. The walls, the interior of the church would have been dominated in this period by a painting or a carving of Christ in Majesty. The saints have been less prominent than they were later, so you've got a sort of less. You're on the way to medieval to what we think of as medieval Catholicism, but there's still a lot left of the old Augustinian tradition.
And hey, Father, if I could jump in on the Archbishop for just 1 second, because this was a post thought that I never going to be able to add into my book, and this would probably be another whole subject matter, but it ties into this time of really looking at salvation, because we really had a poor clergy. We did have some great guys that were trained, but a lot of the clergy were not. We had kind of left somewhat of the Celtic movement in the thought and the process of the end of the 700 ADs, 800 ADs, where we really were talking more of a message of salvation, accepting Christ. Actually, we believe that Patrick even came with the Gospel of John and the Galatian Missal, but we really see the point of what the Archbishop brought about that I think we kind of forget to kind of talk about, is that you were brought up in the church to get baptized. You come to church on Sunday, you follow a good life, and you're saved, and they lost in this time the gospel message.
Because
and we really see
forced to evangelize.
Yeah. And
it was a Christian society, therefore everybody was in the program, so they stopped explaining the program, if you see what I mean.
Exactly. We see a revival, which I'm not going to steal his thunder, coming in later on back into to this, but I think we see some movements in different regions, and still some last vestigements of Columba, the Scottish area, still even in this time, still diving into this, sending some folks in, but we're really at the end of that, and it's now almost from this time until the Protestant Reformation, we all almost see a kind of lapse of the explanation of the church, and they just basically teach if you come to church you're saved, and I think we forget to think about, and even in modern days, that we really need to preach that message. And I think it's more prevalent in this time if you really do some deep studying how much they kind of left off. It became so ritual, and I'm going to wait till the Archbishop, because I know probably where he's going next week, that this next section is kind of like the dark ages of the Christian church, in terms of we distorted where things were going to push, where things come out in the 1500s.
One of the interesting things that you find about medieval cathedral statutes is the actual requirement for preaching is quite low. The provision, for instance, at Lincoln Cathedral in the early days was sermons on the Sundays of Lent, and at Easter, Ascension, Whit Sunday, Trinity Sunday, on the Feast of St. Mary, and on All Saints' Day. So you're talking about the provision of approximately 15 to 18 sermons a year. Preaching is not a big part of the high medieval church. However, it is a period where the textbook becomes very important to the ordinary clergyman. Any clergyman with a smattering of learning had access to, didn't necessarily own, but could get his hands on, the sentences of Peter Lombard, which was a sort of theological encyclopedia intended to provide answers from the fathers on just about every point that crossed the average parish priest's doorstep. But you have to be very clear that there is a huge gap between, on the one hand, the university and the cathedral clergy, who are quite educated, know their theology, and the average parish priest who knows how to baptize, do extreme unction, celebrate the Mass, give the congregation a pep talk from time to time. But, theologically is not that literate. He's like everybody else. He's been taught to pray, pay, and obey. And that's really the medieval approach to Christianity up until the late 15th century, when you begin to see the beginnings of the Devotio Moderna, which leads into the Reformation.
All right, do we have another question? Anybody have a question?
Your Grace, this is Andrew Brazier. I just wanted to ask two things. If you could give kind of a quick summary of nominalism, and it may not be a quick summary, and something I've always been curious is, how have these so-called seven sacraments, how did they develop? And does this time period really increase the quote-unquote number of what was considered a sacrament?
Right. I'm going to leave nominalism until next week, because it becomes important through Duns Scotus. So we're going to have a good look at nominalism the beginning of next week's class. I'll just leave that one for now. The seven sacraments thing is a little bit of a case of pick a number between 2 and 12, because various authorities between the 5th century and the 13th century had argued there were 2 sacraments, there were 7 sacraments, there were 3 sacraments, there were 12 sacraments. It was an ongoing debate. And in the early 13th century, there's something of a movement towards greater definition. So at the Fourth Lateran Council in 1214, they make two important decisions, first of which is the definition of the doctrine of transubstantiation. The second is the decision that we're going to go for 7 sacraments. And it's really more of a pragmatic decision than one that's deeply driven by theology. What it's an attempt to do is bring most of the events of major events of human life within the sacramental system. So you have baptism, confirmation, marriage, extreme unction, the Eucharist, holy orders. You have those as your sacraments and the major turning points of life. And it's this idea of human life being, in a sense, itself sacramental because it's so bound up with the sacraments, that the idea of the 7 sacraments is intended to get across. The other thing was it kept things tidy, because this is also the era where you get, the 7 corporal works of mercy, the 7 deadly sins, 7 sacraments. Let's just keep on with the 7s, okay? Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you, Your Grace.
So, Archbishop, I mean, we're out of time, but maybe we can jam out on this a little bit next week, because I think it was also part of the turning point of the church if we really studied the Druid people, because we were the only ones there doing the plagues that were really helping people, and I think setting up the hospital systems, coming out of the church. And I know there's so much to cover, and that's not really even talked about in this book, but I think it's critical to mention in some of our historical studies of the English church. I mean, I know around the rest of Europe that kind of was, but I think the English church kind of really took up a role on that, probably a little greater, I think, through the monasticism, and we see the role of that through England that I think was more of a pivotal moment than some of the rest of the Europeans. So hopefully that we can tie that in a little bit next week as well.
The other thing is, next week we're probably going to have to go for Monday evening, because I have a visitation in Arizona the following weekend, so I'm leaving here on Thursday. And of course, I don't know how everybody else feels about Halloween. We could do it Tuesday if everybody's all right with Tuesday, because I'm ignoring the front door. Wednesday, of course, is All Saints' Day, so I'll be busy. We've got an evening service here. And then Thursday, I'm on the road.
Yeah, let's go ahead, if it's all right, Your Grace. Let's do Tuesday evening. I'll shoot out an email, remind everybody. I think Tuesday is a great day next week to do that. And of course, I remind everybody I will be sending out a link again. This is recorded, will be up on our YouTube site. So you will be able to listen. I know that Steve and Terry actually appreciated, with some feedback from them, they listened to your last week again to be able to fully understand it. So I will be posting my first one. I'm going to re-record that and post it. So, I encourage everybody, remember, if you're missing something, we will have it posted for you. And if you can't tune in next Tuesday, we will have it online for you. So any final thoughts from anybody?
Father Patrick, can you hear me?
Yes.
You mentioned that there is a YouTube page to which these will be uploaded. Is that a standalone site? And if it is, do you have the link, or is
hey, Father Castellano, I actually did it specifically for you, and I actually sent it out to everybody. If you didn't get the link,
I have it. What I'm asking is there an entire website dedicated to where you're uploading all of these videos, or are they coming individually? That's what I'm asking.
No, yeah. So we have our own YouTube channel for St. Columbus Theological Institute, and
Okay,
then
that's what I was looking for.
yeah, and then Archbishop is in instruction with me right now that we're working through the next couple of months, and we'll be having our own website, and then all of our theological training and classes and his stuff, and whoever else is, Father Castellano, your doctorate, any classes anybody teach, we will be linking that back to our YouTube channel as well.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. All right, any questions, Archbishop? Closing prayer for all of us?
Yes. Let us pray. Direct us, O Lord, in all our doings with thy most gracious favour, and further us with thy continual help, that in all our works begun, continued, and ended in thee, we may glorify thy name, and by thy mercy obtain everlasting life. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
All right, we'll see you guys on Tuesday. I'll send out some info. God bless.
Thank you, Father.